Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You guys sent in some really fascinating stuff for this one, all about what the authors call the blind spot of science.
Yeah, the blind spot, catchy title.
Right. It really piqued my curiosity. So from what I gathered, it's about how, even with all the incredible power of science, there's this kind of this inherent blind spot that can sometimes lead us astray.
It's like we get so focused on the map that we forget about the territory, you know?
Ooh, I like that. The map of the territory. Okay, so lay it out for us then. What exactly is this blind spot and why should we care?
Well, in a nutshell, it's the idea that the very way we do science, the methods we use, the models we create, can sometimes prevent us from seeing certain aspects of reality.
So it's not that science is wrong or anything, it's more like it's a particular way of seeing.
Exactly, and like any way of seeing it has its limitations.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does this actually play out in the real world? Got any good examples?
Sure, let's start with something really basic, something we all experience every day. Temperature.
Temperature. Seems pretty straightforward to me. It's hot, it's cold, we measure it with a thermometer.
But there's more to it than meets the eye. Before we had thermometers, how did we understand temperature?
I guess just by how it felt. If it's scorching outside, you know it without needing a weather report.
Precisely. It was all about direct experience. But then along comes the thermometer, and suddenly we're quantifying temperature with numbers.
And that's when things start to get interesting, right? Because as our measurements got more precise, we discovered that those seemingly fixed points, like the boiling point of water, well, they weren't so fixed after all.
Yeah, remember, scientists love to control variables, right? So they create these ideal conditions, these workshops, as the sources call them, to isolate and study phenomena.
Makes sense. You want to eliminate as much outside interference as possible.
Right, but here's the thing. They found that even something as seemingly simple as the boiling point of water changes depending on things like altitude.
Wait, really? So water doesn't always boil at 212 degrees Fahrenheit?
Well, it does at sea level. But go up a mountain and suddenly that boiling point drops.
Huh, I never knew that. So you're telling me my pasta's been cooking all wrong this whole time?
Maybe, maybe not. But it does illustrate this key point. In trying to pin down temperature precisely to create this perfect model, we stumbled upon this deeper complexity.
Okay, I'm starting to see where you're going with this. It's like the more we zoomed in on temperature, the more we realized that our initial understanding based on direct experience was just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. And this tension between our lived experience and the scientific models we create, that's the blind spot in action.
Fascinating. So we've got our maps and our territories, and sometimes they align, but sometimes they diverge in surprising ways.
And the danger is when we mistake the map for the territory, forgetting that our models are just representations, not reality itself.
Okay, I'm hooked. So how does this blind spot play out with even bigger, more abstract ideas? All right, so we've got our maps and our territories, and we've seen how even something as seemingly simple as temperature can reveal this blind spot in our thinking.
It's a subtle but pervasive gap, and it pops up in some really unexpected places.
Well, speaking of unexpected places, let's talk about time, because that's something we all experience, but it seems like science often views it in a very particular way.
Absolutely. Time, it's one of those fundamental concepts that we tend to take for granted. But the sources you provided really dig into how the scientific view of time often clashes with our lived experience of it.
Yeah, like intuitively we know that an hour spent doing something enjoyable flies by, while an hour stuck in traffic feels like an eternity.
That's exactly it. We have these expressions because deep down we understand that time isn't just this neutral objective thing.
It's relative, like Einstein said.
Well, it's even more fundamental than that. It's about the quality of those moments, the way they're colored by our emotions, our focus, our state of being.
So it's not just about the ticking of the clock, but how those ticks actually feel.
Exactly. And this is something that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries. Henri Bergson, for instance, he called this subjective experience of time duration.
Duration, I like that. Captures that sense of time stretching and compressing, depending on what we're doing and how we're feeling.
Precisely. An hour lost in a good book is a completely different experience than an hour spent worrying about a deadline.
No argument there. But here's the thing that gets me half. Science, at least how I learned it, always seemed to want to strip away those subjective elements like they were somehow less real.
And that's a perfect example of the blind spot in action. Because even in physics, the science that's supposed to be all about objective laws and precise measurements, we see this disconnect.
Oh yeah. Give me an example.
Well, think about Newton's laws of motion. They work equally well whether time is running forward or backward. A ball's trajectory is reversible, but our lives, our experiences are not.
Whoa, that's actually kind of tricky when you think about it.
Right. It highlights this inherent asymmetry in how we experience time versus how it's often represented in physics.
So even at the most basic level, the physics of time doesn't quite capture the full reality of our lived experience.
And it gets even wilder when we consider how science has expanded our notion of time beyond our everyday experience.
You mean like with things like cosmic time and the vastness of the universe?
Exactly. We talk about billions of years since the Big Bang timescales that dwarf our human lifespans.
I know, it's mind-blowing. But honestly, it also makes me feel kind of insignificant, you know? Like my whole existence is just a blip in this grand cosmic timeline.
And that feeling right there is another manifestation of the blind spot.
How so?
Well, it's this idea that science can provide us with a view from nowhere, an objective perspective detached from our human experience.
I see. So we can zoom out and contemplate the universe's entire history, but in doing so, we risk losing touch with the immediacy, the preciousness of our own finite time.
Precisely. It's not that one perspective is inherently better or worse, but the danger is in mistaking the map for the territory, believing that the scientific model of time fully encompasses the richness and complexity of our lived experience.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation about time already, and it makes me wonder, how does this blind spot manifest in even weirder, more mind-boggling areas of science? Like, what happens when we apply this same thinking to something like quantum physics? So we've gone from the familiar heat of a stovetop to the almost incomprehensible vastness of cosmic time. And now I'm a little nervous to see where this goes next. Because if time and temperature have these blind spots, well, I can only imagine what happens when we get to something like quantum physics, where things get really, really strange.
You're not wrong to be nervous. Quantum physics is where the blind spot starts to feel less like a gap and more like a chasm, you know?
Yeah, it's definitely where I start to bump up against the limits of my own intuition. But also, it's just infinitely fascinating, even if I only understand a fraction of it.
That's the appropriate response, I think. Awe, confusion, a little existential dread. It comes with the territory.
Right. It's like it's just physics, the study of the very, very small. But somehow, it manages to call into question everything we thought we knew about how reality works.
Exactly. Because at the quantum level, the blind spot isn't just a discrepancy between our experience and our models. It's like the models themselves start to break down.
Okay, now you've got my attention.
Yeah.
So what are you saying? That quantum physics suggests we're not just passively observing the universe, but actually shaping it with our minds.
Well, it's not quite that simple, but some of these sources do argue that the act of observation might be inseparable from the reality being observed.
Hold on, back up a second. So you're saying that it's not just that our instruments are clumsy or that we're introducing bias, it's more fundamental than that.
Much more. Take the idea of superposition, for example.
Superposition.
Yeah, it's the idea that a particle doesn't exist in a definite state until it's measured. Like before you flip a coin, it's both heads and tails at the same time. And then when you flip it and look at the result, you collapse that superposition into a single state.
Okay, I think I get the analogy. But so you're saying until we actually observe something in the quantum world, it's like it's in this blurry state of pure potential.
That's one way to think about it. And it completely messes with our everyday intuition, where things seem solid and defined. But at the quantum level, reality is much fuzzier, much less certain, until we bring it into focus with an observation.
And that's where the blind spot comes back in full force, right?
Exactly. Our very attempts to pin down reality, to make it conform to our models of measurement, might actually be changing the very thing we're trying to measure.
It's like trying to grab a fistful of water. The harder you squeeze, the more slips through your fingers.
I like that analogy. And this isn't just some philosophical thought experiment. It has real-world implications. It's the foundation for things like quantum computers, which exploit these bizarre quantum properties to do things that would be impossible with classical computers.
It's mind-blowing to think about how something so strange at the smallest scales could have such huge implications for technology.
And it really forces us to confront the limits of our own understanding, because even the most brilliant minds in physics are still arguing about what quantum mechanics really means, how to interpret these bizarre findings.
So even at the cutting edge of scientific discovery, we're still bumping up against this blind spot. This reminder that our models, no matter how elegant or sophisticated, are not reality itself.
And maybe that's the most important takeaway from all of this, that science, for all its power and precision, is still ultimately a human endeavor, shaped by our perspectives, our assumptions, and yes, our blind spots.
This whole conversation has really been a trip from the everyday to the cosmic to the downright bizarre. And the more we've explored, the more I've realized how much our way of seeing the world shapes the world we see.
It's like that saying, we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. Our biases, our assumptions, our blind spots, they all color our perception of reality.
And by becoming aware of those blind spots, by acknowledging the limitations of our models, we open ourselves up to a richer, more nuanced understanding of the world.
Exactly. It's not about abandoning science or rejecting reason, but about recognizing their limits and embracing the mystery and wonder that lie beyond.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the blind spot of science.
My pleasure. It's been a fascinating journey.
And to our listeners, keep those questions coming. Keep exploring. And remember, sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones that make us question everything we thought we knew. Until next time.